There's an adage that if you want to change the course of a river, you go as far upstream as you can and you move one rock. And so sometimes, that little thing in the corner, they may say, oh yeah, actually, I just remembered that really annoys me every time I see it. And I was like, okay, so what are you doing to yourself every time you see something that annoys you? Two things, like you feel annoyed and then you try to tune it out. So you're teaching yourself to tune out things. So then how are you going to tune into what it is that you actually need if you're practicing tuning out?
Are you looking for ways to diversify your income? In January, I'm starting a cohort of therapists to start creating online content to increase your impact, influence, and income. Visit coursecreationstudio.com and look for resources on starting your own online course today. Hello, and welcome to the Scaling Therapy Practice. This is your host, James Marland. This is the show where we empower mission-driven leaders to launch life-changing online courses. Thanks for joining us on the show. I'm here with my special guest, Mark Ainley, who writes, teaches, and consults internationally on Feng Shui. This is something that I am not an expert in. If you ever look at my office or my floor, I actually am probably a disaster. So I'm really happy to have Mark on the show today where he can talk about ways to make your office and your environment more accommodating and less stressful, which I think is going to be very beneficial to therapists. So Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Mark, introduce yourself to the audience. We often don't start out teaching online courses. We often don't start in this online digital world. You have some experience that that you are bringing to us before. So how did you get started in what you're doing?
Oh, great question. And, like many things in life, and I think, I've been listening to a few of your guests, so many people didn't start off in the field that they're currently in. It's like the practice that they're in found them. And that was definitely the case with Feng Shui. I lived in Japan as an English teacher starting in '92 in the pre-internet world. Some of us are older than Google and remember that. And I moved to London and moved in with a friend of a friend who had a book on Feng Shui. And so I was exposed to Feng Shui and immediately just loved the concept of the fact that we can engage with what seems to be just physical space and our mindset changes and our experiences change. And I just thought, how malleable is our reality and how interconnected is our reality in ways that we don't necessarily see. Then moving back to Canada, I continued just practicing for myself for several years and then met a great teacher in Vancouver, Canada, where I now live. And I was part of her first of the only 2 training programs that she ever taught. And I just started doing more and more of it. And I didn't think I was going to get into it professionally, but, it was just, I start helping people, helping out friends. They're starting to see improvements. And I'm like, well, if people are getting better, why wouldn't I want to help people improve their experiences? So I did my training in 2001. So there was, rudimentary, websites and internet and MSN Messenger and email, which we didn't check every day. Do you remember the days when we didn't check email every day? It's like
it is invasive. Email is invasive.
It's so different. But that also speaks to the fact that, what we engage with in our daily lives in the physical world has an impact on our mindset and our state of being. So I was teaching, there certainly wasn't online teaching back then. I was teaching in person and I would put up, flyers in stores or in places, health food stores. And it was like the old way of, people take a tab with a phone number. And I was hosting workshops in my living room. And then people were hosting me and having me go to other towns in British Columbia and Canada and other places for quite a while, like every 2 weeks. I was teaching a seminar and, these were the days when people had an attention span as well. And they would go and they'd make a plan and they go to attend something for their own benefit for 2.5 hours. It was like, a 2.5 hour workshop. Getting anybody to sit still for an hour nowadays seems to be a challenge. And so it was very, very different. And I loved teaching in person. I trained in a few different practices and I had very good teachers. And one of the things I learned from one of them was, using a flip chart and using really colorful pens. I've got my Mr. Sketch markers that smell great. And I love the spontaneity of being able to do something on a flip chart. And, I would have a skeleton outline for what I taught. And then, it would be spontaneous and something would come up from one of the participants. And, I loved the interactivity of the teaching situation because, of course, Feng Shui is all about that interactivity between you and the environment and how something changes and then there's something new that comes. So my seminars were always very spontaneous, but there was the primary, structure that I had. And, then Skype came in and I started consulting. Even before Skype, I had a client in Japan. They mailed me photos and we had the consultation over the phone.
Wow.
Started going to Japan regularly, so 1, 2, 3 times a year for, from 2003. I started teaching there until, going there until COVID. And then, I've been doing it on Zoom ever since. And the challenge for me then was, this was the initial challenge leading into online teaching, was when you have a room full of 100 people, you can't just do flip chart. So you need a slide. And you need a slideshow, you need to set structure. And you set structure, then you have to anticipate some questions or you have to anticipate some things that you can't be as spontaneous with. So that that changed my teaching style or course creation style. And then when COVID hit and we were forced to online, as opposed to just occasionally, I'd have clients who couldn't afford to fly me out to Qatar or Bali. I would love to go to some of these places. We would consult on Skype and then, Zoom took over when COVID hit. And so then online teaching became the norm. And I resisted it for a while, but of course it was a necessity. And now I absolutely love it. I miss and still love in-person presentations. I still do them. I have some design firms in Vancouver that will bring me in, and the people have just been, in the last couple of years, relishing those in-person gatherings. But there's also great benefit to teaching online, especially with my material where people are actually in their homes when they're learning about how to adjust their homes. So in my courses, what I'll do is I'll always work in, okay, you're going to go take a look at your front door that we just talked about for 1 minute, and you're going to sort of just see what it is that you notice based on what it is you just learned. So it actually becomes their setting, and them being at home actually becomes part of the workshop. And then it becomes more interactive again because they'll have feedback or they'll have observations, and that can lead to another teaching point. So
Very applicable too, right? Like it's like you can apply it. I bet, I don't know if you stumbled on this or you planned it that way, but applying it and using it right away is probably one of the best ways for people to cement it or get it inside them rather than, I go to a conference and I learn, I sit for 3 hours or whatever, and then I come home, then I might do it or I might not. But yeah, if you build it in, that sounds brilliant. How did you come up with that?
I mean, it was just kind of the realization that, I've often realized that, the map and the territory can be very different. And in Feng Shui, there's one kind of map that people look at to map out, figure out which area represents what theme of their life. But, when you start looking at things in 3 dimensions, it's very different than when you're looking at a piece of paper. And I've often realized this, when I was teaching English in Japan, a lot of my students would have their writing would be great, but they couldn't speak at the same level. And it's different brain functions. And you want to have some consistency throughout your capacity to use anything. And so I realized pretty soon, the first Zoom seminar that I taught was on home offices, of course, because, everybody was at home working when they weren't used to it. And I was like, okay, great. Let's just take a minute now and go take a look at this or that. And it was fantastic. And I realized, no, this is a new way of teaching and a great benefit. In addition to the sense of community that gets created when I have people in 5 countries across 5 time zones in the same room with each other, when that wouldn't happen if we weren't online.
That's great. So you're starting to develop or go in history, you're developing your online course or delivering your services online. What were some of the challenges for you and lessons learned as you started to engage in that more often?
Well, what I realized is, three-dimensionally, it's very different than 2D, obviously. And, of course, I would say, the ideal is to be in person, but to be honest, I can actually see things really clearly online. And I think, though, it comes from the tons of experience of doing it in person. I think if I was starting doing it online, it would be very, very different. I would not have the skill set. But, when they talk about, the 10,000 hours thing, I mean, I definitely have more than 10,000 hours in terms of consulting and teaching and the like, right? Over 23 years, and plus my amateur explorations, for 5 years before I trained. So I started, what happens online is, people will pan the camera and they have what they want me to see. And I'm very respectful, this is the thing that's really a judgment-free zone, but I can tell sometimes just by how the camera moves, or I can see like a little dead spot, like they might think, oh, that corner is not important or whatever, we're looking at the counters in the kitchen and not this corner. I'll just, can you just move the camera back a little more slowly and just go to the sink over there? And I just want, what's happening over there on the side and the corner next to the sink? And, my eye will be drawn. And that's something that I think really just comes from experience. And so I've come to realize that, yeah, we sometimes need to slow down, of course. I mean, that's kind of the main thing in our culture, where I think everybody needs to slow down. But also all of the details are important. And sometimes details get glossed over, and the details make the big picture. And the detail, so you change one detail, there's an adage that if you want to change the course of a river, you go as far upstream as you can and you move one rock. And so sometimes, that little thing in the corner, they may say, oh yeah, actually, I just remembered that really annoys me every time I see it. And I was like, okay, so what are you doing to yourself every time you see something that annoys you? Two things, like you feel annoyed and then you try to tune it out. So you're teaching yourself to tune out things. So then how are you going to tune into what it is that you actually need if you're practicing tuning out?
You make an excuse, or you justify, or you're like, oh, I'll get to that later.
Yeah.
Or it's not that big of a deal.
That's right. And the thing is, our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness, I think, and that's our adaptability. Because we can adapt in order to survive, as we should, and we can get by, bypassing. We don't have the time to deal with this, or, the reality of, my mother grew up in the war in Hungary. Things are changing and you need to adapt. But then in less dire circumstances, like at home, you've adapted to, that sticky door, that door squeaking all the time, and it annoys you, but it becomes more background because, hedonic adaptation kicks in, which is that whole same old aspect of the brain where you just get used to things. And you then tune it out, and it's still annoying you in the background. And it's still something in your home, which is a space where you actually have authority and control and command in a way that you don't in the outside world. And you're not stepping up to the plate and taking care of yourself by taking care of your space. Then what happens in the outside world? But what happens to that attitude of overlooking necessary details? Yes, that annoys me, but I'll ignore it. Well, how many annoyances are you then going to keep ignoring? So, and he looks around his office as I say this, right?
Wow. I already confessed to you. I'm not super proud of my office. Yeah. There are a few things that I overlook for sure.
Yeah, so, and we all do. And the thing is to not judge, though, right? And the thing is, just like the first step is just recognizing it's the same for everybody. Everybody, I think, I'm pretty easygoing. As much as people, as soon as they hear the term Feng Shui, they hear a rule. And I like to talk about principles rather than rules, because I think it really changes the reality. Perfection is an illusion. It's not about perfect. I see this stuff on Instagram with all these hyper perfect kitchens that are just clinical and everything's in plastic containers. And I'm just like, yeah, chaos is going to come into your life in some way and you won't be prepared for it. I think that hypervigilance in the physical world is not what this is about. This is about really creating ease. It's about consciousness of relationship. It's like any of the, I know you host a lot of therapists on your program, right? You don't make changes overnight. Things take time. You start to get awareness of patterns, and then you start to implement changes. But if you don't know the consequences, or if it's just something saying, oh, I never thought about that before, I haven't paid attention to it, it's a lot harder to make the change. So the first step is just knowing it. And then if you can say, hey, you know what, I actually don't really like this. Well, that's the first step to then making a change.
I'm going to ask you more about that in a second, but as we were talking, I was imagining a day or a time when I had as many things as I could in order, and I wasn't annoyed by the can of spray air up there. It was put away in its place, or the books that I was reading are on the shelf instead of like I'm walking over them to get my desk. They're not big annoyances,
Yeah.
but can you imagine a time when things were not perfect, but they were as perfect as they were going to be, where you were not constantly annoyed and overlooking the little things that were annoying you, and just how calm and peaceful would your work environment, let's talk about work environment, I guess, because this is my work environment. How much more creative or better would I be if I wasn't dealing with some of the buzzy negative things in my head? Is that sort of one of the goals, or a simplified version of Feng Shui?
Absolutely. It's opening your eyes. When you reduce the background noise, I mean, you tune into the signal more, right? And you can always pay attention to the signal, but you imagine, if there's a program you really want to watch, or a radio you want to listen to, the old days you'd listen on shortwave or something, you'd hear some static, or you'd hear some noise, but you could still hear the signal and you could still tune in. And you adapt though, and your ears adapt. In my musical life, I'm a curator of historical recordings. So I actually am, I'm an expert on that. I write for International Piano Magazine, and I know how to listen through the scratch and the noise of old recordings to hear the signal. And yet, if you don't have to, why not? Why not get rid of that? And the fact is, if right now you have to, because the reality is, you're taking care of an elderly parent, or you're super busy, or you really have this schedule, then that's fine. I also like to say that, if you've got things on your desk because you're using them right now, that's actually not clutter. That's stuff that's in use. So I think we need to really define our terms. Are you really using this right now? Are they there for, a day, for a week, for a month? I think it's, as long as things aren't settling, it's different. I like to define clutter. I think people misunderstand clutter. I've got three qualities that I think lead to clutter. Is things are not being used, things are not in the right place, or you don't actually have space for them. So if your bookcases are full, then the books are going to be on the floor, on the tables, and all of that, because you actually don't have a shelf that they will fit in. But if the bookcase is full of books that you're not using, then that's going to also lead to the fact that, well, then those ones are going to be displaced, the ones that you are using. And so it's a matter of, just, as I say, of conscious relationship. With Feng Shui, what we start to do is we look at the symbolism of the physical items, because everything in the physical world relates to your mindset and to your consciousness. So what do you get from books? You get knowledge and wisdom. So what's your relationship with your knowledge and wisdom in your life? And how are you integrating that into your life is how you are integrating those into your physical space. So if your books are all over the place, you might have a lot of knowledge, but have you created a structure in your life where you're maximizing the use and the expression of your knowledge and wisdom? I know. So this is kind of the fun stuff. This is where Feng Shui is really not just about, hang some wind chimes and, just put a lucky bamboo over somewhere. And those can be great. I call myself a contemporary Feng Shui consultant because I'm really working with the principles which have been universal for thousands of years, but the expression, how you apply those, can be very, very different and very individual. You don't have to have a home decorated in the way that you don't want. It's your home. You don't have to please me. Your home only has to really please you, and of course, whoever else you're sharing the space with. So yeah, it's kind of wild to think. There's. I think one of the issues for all of us when it comes to this is how do we deal with constraints? How do we deal with limitation? Because we only have so much space. Like, that's a limitation, and that's a constraint. And historically, all of us since childhood, no, you can't get that because you've had too much, or we don't have enough money, or we don't have whatever. All of that sort of is, in the background and gets triggered when we can't do what we want. And the irony is, at home, that's the space where generally you can do more of what you want than elsewhere in the outside world. Now, of course, I'm not minimizing, people who live in home situations where, there's challenging family or relationship dynamics, or, issues where they don't have a chance to exert their authority. But I'm speaking ideally, relatively. And for them, it might be the office. That might be the place where they actually have some more authority and capacity to exert, their own will and appropriate self-care. But
so let's talk about that for just a little bit, to get maybe some practical advice or tips for people who are working in the office.
yeah,
We'll do this. Like, what does it do for them, and how do they get started? Like, I know you probably could talk about this for hours, but if you could,
like, you have to sort of there needs to be a power cut at the streaming office headquarters for me to stop talking.
But yeah, like, if somebody's looking at their office right now, what would these principles do for them, and how could they get started?
The first thing is one of the things that can really help is take a photo of your workspace, because you're going to look at a photo differently. You're going to see it differently. Like, would you Instagram that? Probably not. Okay. So then that gives you a chance to see it outside of the normal, like how your brain normally interacts with the space. The benefit, Scientific American magazine years ago, at least 10 years ago, possibly more, I think, had an article on how employees who have a say in how their workspace is decorated and is appointed are more productive and they're more satisfied. So there have been studies on this. And of course, this is, a study conducted by the Center for Really Obvious Things. This is like, it's super obvious. I really want to make sure that people, ideally, you have what you need absolutely is there and is easy to access. Like, if there's something you go for really regularly, but you have to, get bent out of shape physically, then you're going to feel that emotionally and mentally. I have to reach for this thing and it's in an inconvenient location. We'll move it somewhere else. Cables is a really fun thing, because cables are super unsightly. They're really tough to manage and really annoying to manage. And when you pay to go to a first-class hotel, first-class restaurant, lounge, all of those places, a resort, you are not going to see cables. That is part what you're paying for in a luxurious environment. Is somebody has minimized the extraneous visual noise. And so, there's a beautiful hotel lounge in Vancouver, and I've gone in there, and it kind of amazed me that I was looking. They have a lamp, with this beautiful dim lighting at each dining table, and it was wow. And I just went up closely to see how they'd wrapped up the cord really tightly and made it invisible and wrapped it to go down behind, and that's part of that environment.
But it doesn't happen on accident, right? Like, somebody had to think about that.
That's exactly it. And so with Feng Shui, what we start doing is we start thinking about the stuff that we just normally bypass or just say, well, that's not important. It is all kind of important. I think that having at least one item that's colorful and, playful and personal, or combination thereof, in the space is important. And I'm not talking about, snarky mugs that's like, don't talk to me until I've had my third coffee, because I think that actually breeds and, condones a snarky mindset at work, that you're sort of confirming that you're not happy to be at work. I'm not into that. I'm also not necessarily into the beach photos and the sort of I'd rather be here kind of mindset. Having your
Mhm.
family, family photo there is great. Having something that is calming, and it might be an image of a forest or flowers. If you can have real flowers or a plant, I have a plant on my desk. Something that's natural would be ideal because our bodies come from nature. We are constantly in a built environment, a human constructed and designed environment that has few elements, unfortunately, far too few elements in common with the environments that we lived in historically. And there's a great expression by the folks who run Science in Design, who I'm going to be doing some training with, that say you can take the person out of the Stone Age and you can't take the Stone Age out of the person. And, we respond to color, we respond to straight lines, which in nature are always aggressive and a weapon. You think about porcupine quills, cactus quills, sharp edges of rocks. Your nervous system recognizes a lot of these things as threats. So if you can do one colorful thing, one playful thing that might also be practical, and I'll show, for those of us who are watching this, I decided, I got a mouse pad, the Cosmos, and it's colorful and it's round and it's soft. Because I realized, my hard desk is really convenient for writing and is really convenient for storing things, of course. But how about if I bring in a bit of the opposite harmoniously? So it's soft. And then I use a color that doesn't exist elsewhere and has an image that is, that I really like.
Meaningful. Yeah.
Well, so choosing one item, and if you can do something practical and make it nicer, like you get a really nice paperclip container, maybe you have really colorful paper clips, or they're just golden paper clips, something like this that's just going to make it feel upscale. I think that's really important. And there's a lot. I have a whole seminar on, home, working the office at home or in the workplace, things that
that's probably a good time to talk about.
Mhm.
You have resources and you've been doing this for a while. You have a lot of wealth of information. If somebody's looking to go a little further and do some exploring and learn how to do some of this for themselves so they can experience that calming, the calming piece. And what did I write down? You were talking about music and I said, the scratch is so loud, you can't hear the signal.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah.
if the scratch in your environment is so loud, you can't concentrate, or it's harder for you to concentrate and you're fighting through it, you might need some support to help you get your environment back in line with what is feeling good for you. So anyways, Mark, what do you offer? What do you do? How do you help people? Can you
Sure.
tell me about that?
Absolutely. So I started teaching, 1 hour lunch and learns, during the COVID period. And I then started offering, monthly, as I call them, Wednesday Wisdom or Wisdom Wednesday seminar. So once a month, I would do a 90-minute seminar on a different topic. I've got about 15-ish of those that are sort of, that I've taught a few times. So I'm actually in the process of now setting up my Thinkific page so that I'll have those pre-recorded. So that way it's not, people have to wait a month or people have to wait whatever. People can go, it's there, the wisdom is there, and they can start applying things and pause them and, not have to do it just on class time. And they can really make it interactive on their own schedule. I've got an 8-part rather, 16-hour program called The Story of Your Stuff that goes into what we were talking about, books being knowledge and wisdom, and this whole process you go through to look at your inner relationship with the topic. And then what you start doing, and then there's practical exercises for what you do with the outside manifestation of those. So that I've taught interactively several times. I've had several people who took the course 2, 3, or even 4 times, committed to that because they just found, now I can do more on this other area, and I just love hearing the information repeated. So that's also going to be at some point. I'm going to focus on the shorter seminars first, and then I'm going to do the pre-recording of, the story of your stuff as a self-paced online program. So right now, my website's got some articles. I've been active on Instagram, but I'm a little tired, to be honest, of just the algorithm stuff. The fact that you get rewarded for being a graphic designer is just not my strength. It's not what I want to do. I like creating the spaces in the home. And I think people are more into, what you're doing with the podcast. People enjoy listening. People want to hear, hearing a real voice, hearing a story, hearing an organic presentation. I think there's, again, not taking the Stone Age out of the person. There's something with how it is that we get information through our senses, and it's through this, around the campfire storytelling. There's something with what it is that you and I do with these kinds of presentations. So a podcast might, by the time this episode airs, might already have
Great.
started.
Yeah, podcasting's great. I love it. It gives me introduction to people and ideas and relationships, because, information is getting a little more easy to access, of course, with Google and AI, but you can't get the person. Like, you can't get Mark without Mark, and you are invaluable. Like, you are, what you bring to the table can't be reproduced in, tell me about Feng Shui.
Yeah, I mean, there is some of that, and there's words, but then there's the teaching and there's the application, right? And there's knowledge, and then there's the application of that, and how do you apply that? And there's a lot of these gaps that can be in there, and that's, from 20 plus years experience. Of course, there's lots of great Feng Shui consultants out there, and everybody has their own approach, and people will gravitate towards whoever's style and approach works for them. I am fortunate enough that I've worked with a wide demographic of, ages, genders, nationalities, and so on. So I'm fairly sensitive to all of the individual needs and wants, and also, possible obstructions. I like to say that, I've convinced more skeptical husbands whose wives paid for the Feng Shui consultation. They were sort of, really grumbling and not really wanting to go along with it. And in 30 seconds, I can get them actually engaged. Do you want to hear what gets them engaged?
Yes.
The cost of a Super Bowl commercial. Do you know how much the airtime is for a Super Bowl commercial?
Oh, I lost track of it, but it's millions.
Yes. So the last 2 years, it's been $7 million for 30 seconds.
30 seconds, yeah.
$233,000 a second. So that's because profit-motivated companies are paying for access to your brain through your eyes. And because they know that what you look at, presented in a certain way, has the capacity to change how you think and how you're going to behave. So what's the cost? And what's the value of what you look at for weeks, months, and years?
It's a lot.
And are you selling yourself short?
You are. Oh, wow. So that's good. That's good stuff, man, because I'm going to look at my office when I turn this mic, turn the mic off, I'm going to be looking at my office. But also, you've given me something to think about. Like, I can do something about it. Like, I don't have to, if I'm done using something, and if I have a place where I put it away, if that spot is full, then maybe I should reduce what I have.
Yes.
Like it's not just, I have to live in this environment of little discomforts that I don't even think about.
That's right.
I can live in the environment that I want to create.
That's it.
And if I like books and I want to have a lot of books and that makes me feel good, I can have my books.
Yes. I mean, it's not about creating it according to somebody else's metric. And I think this is what's really important, that, and people will criticize all kinds of, minimalist and organizers and so on and so forth. And I just want to say, there can be lots of great information out there, but you also have to choose what's really going to work for you. And that doesn't mean, people can use this to bypass things that actually would be better for them if they changed it, right? So I'll just live in a mess because I'm comfortable with that. I actually taught one of the first work at home seminars that I taught. There was a guy who said, no, listen, I work really well, even though my desk is messy, even though this and that. So he sat through the whole seminar, and a week later, he sent me before and after photos. He's like, no, I thought about it. And I said, well, why not? When I said, if you're not commuting to work, you're not spending an hour, 30 minutes, even 15 minutes. What if you spend 15 minutes at the beginning of the day and the end of the day to sort of, that's your commute, and you're closing down the office? And he did.
That's a great place to start, isn't it? Yeah. Like,
just if you do 1 minute, if you do 1 minute, 1 minute is a whole lot more than 0 minutes. And what you do in 1 minute makes a difference. And then you start to realize that all the little things we do right? The kind words we say to people, the nice gestures, the holding the door open for someone, all these little things make a difference in the lives of others. And we can do that for ourselves. So that kindness to yourself by taking care of your environment. And again, not to be perfect. That's not the point. But to be able to support yourself in the way that, the chair you're sitting in is supporting you. The floor that you stand on and that your feet are on now is supporting you. That your environment supports you whether you know it or not. But if you enhance that level of support visually, emotionally, and so on, you can feel more supported. And then you're in a position to be able to support others much better.
That's a wonderful place and a wonderful thought to end on. Mark, thanks for coming on the show. Where can people find, what's your website again?
senseofspace.com. And it's got links to all my social media networks, or however active I am on those for the time being. And there will be links. There's a workshops tab and seminars tab. And, once the Thinkific page gets launched imminently, there'll be links to that as well.
Great. Well, all those links will be on the show notes. You can find them in the show notes tab and on my webpage. I really enjoyed this conversation. I do feel like I've learned a lot. Thanks, Mark, for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, James.
And thanks again for listening to the Scaling Therapy Practice. It's now time to put your mission in motion and maybe spend a minute cleaning up the floor.